I didn't pay for a luxury cabin just to sit next to people who clearly don't belong here." Her voice froze the entire premier cabin. She stood there, gripping her designer tote like it gave her authority, staring at the Black family in Suite P1 as if they had crossed an invisible border. One sentence, and suddenly the flight wasn't about travel anymore. Marcus Reed didn't rush. He never did. He walked into the premier cabin the same way he walked into most rooms, quietly, without asking for space, and without assuming he deserved less of it. Naomi followed beside him, her hand resting lightly on Caleb's shoulder. Not to guide him, just to remind him she was there. Caleb took a small step forward, eyes wide, taking in the soft lighting, the wide seats, the polished calm that felt more like a library than an airplane. He whispered something to his mother. She smiled and nodded. They weren't acting impressed. They weren't acting entitled. They were just present. And somehow, that alone was enough to make them noticeable. A few heads turned, not openly, not dramatically, just long enough to register something didn't match an expectation no one had said out loud. Marcus lifted their boarding passes, offered a polite nod to the flight attendant, and thanked her. Not loudly, not performatively. Just a quiet, habitual thank you. She returned the smile, then hesitated. Just a fraction of a second too long. Caleb noticed. He always did. He looked down at his shoes, then back at the seat numbers, as if he wanted to make sure they were in the right place. Suite P1, right where they were supposed to be. Naomi caught the look. She squeezed his hand once, reassurance without explanation. Across the aisle, Evelyn Carter had already stopped pretending to scroll on her phone. Her sunglasses were pushed up on her head, even though they were indoors. Her designer tote rested on her arm like a badge of authority. Her eyes followed every step the family took, not with curiosity, but with calculation. She didn't say anything. Not yet. She tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they're trying to figure out how a mistake happened. Not if. How. Marcus helped Caleb stow his small backpack. Careful. Unhurried. The kind of care that didn't ask for approval. Caleb slid into his seat, feet dangling, trying not to touch anything that looked too expensive. He folded his hands in his lap. Naomi adjusted her scarf and offered a quiet apology to the attendant for the minor delay. The attendant shook her head. "It's fine," she said, but her eyes flicked once toward Evelyn before returning. That glance didn't go unnoticed. Evelyn leaned closer to Thomas. Not enough for anyone else to hear, just enough to make her discomfort known. Thomas nodded, out of habit. Evelyn's eyes stayed fixed on the family, not hostile, not aggressive. Assessing. It wasn't anger yet, it was disbelief, because in her mind, this wasn't a shared space, it was a hierarchy. And something about this picture didn't fit the order she had memorized. Marcus fastened his seatbelt and glanced around the cabin. He noticed the stairs. He always noticed them. He just didn't respond to them. He had learned a long time ago that reacting too quickly made people more uncomfortable, not less. Silence, in his world, was often safer than explanation. Naomi, however, felt it differently. She had learned to read rooms the way sailors read tides, not for beauty, for danger. And this room had shifted, not loudly, not violently, just enough to make her shoulders straighten. Caleb leaned closer to her. "Mom?" he whispered. "Yes, baby. Did we do something wrong?" She didn't answer immediately, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew what he was really asking. "No," she said gently. "You didn't." He nodded, but he didn't look convinced. Across the aisle, Evelyn exhaled sharply, as if patience itself was something she was tired of offering. She glanced at their seat numbers, once, then again. Suite P1. The front, the best. Her fingers tightened slightly around her tote. She leaned back in her seat, crossed her legs, and looked away. But only for a moment, because her discomfort wasn't about proximity. It was about permission. In her world, certain spaces came with unspoken rules, and one of those rules had just been challenged. Not by words, not by confrontation, by presence. Marcus reached for the in-flight magazine and flipped a page. Calm, unbothered. To an outside observer, it would have looked like nothing was happening. No raised voices, no conflict, no scene. Just a family taking their seats. But the tension wasn't in what was said. It was in what was being assumed. That this was temporary. That someone would correct the mistake. That order would be restored. Evelyn adjusted her posture, straightening her spine like she was preparing to speak, then stopped. She watched, waiting for the moment she would no longer have to. Thomas glanced at her, then back at the family, then down at his phone. Avoidance was easier than acknowledgement. The flight attendant moved down the aisle, continuing her routine. Drinks, smiles, professional calm. But every time she passed Suite P1, her pace slowed slightly. Not because of suspicion, because of anticipation. Something was coming. Caleb pulled out his headphones and placed them on his ears without turning them on. A small shield, a child's version of armor. Naomi noticed and brushed a loose curl from his forehead. He didn't look at her. Marcus rested his hands on his knees and stared forward, not defiant, not submissive. Steady. He had learned that steadiness unsettled people more than resistance. And Evelyn felt it. She shifted again, crossed and uncrossed her legs. Adjusted her blouse. Because for the first time since she boarded, something was not under her control. Not the seating, not the silence, not the certainty. The cabin remained quiet, polished, perfectly normal, and yet something fundamental had already changed. Not with a shout, not with an insult, but with the quiet arrival of a family that had every right to be there, and absolutely no intention of explaining why. Evelyn Carter didn't raise her voice, not yet. She adjusted the strap of her handbag, straightened her posture, and pressed the call button above her seat. Once, then again, a little firmer. The flight attendant approached with the same polite expression she gave everyone. "Yes, ma'am?" Evelyn smiled. It was the kind of smile that looked courteous but felt like a warning. "There seems to be a small mix-up," she said, glancing toward Suite P1 without turning her head fully. "I don't think those seats were supposed to be occupied." The word hung in the air. The attendant blinked. "I'm sorry, ma'am?" Evelyn leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "When I booked this flight, I specifically selected Premier Cabin for the privacy. That's what I pay for. Exclusivity. Quiet." She paused. "And I assumed the front suites were reserved." The attendant glanced at her tablet. "They're fully ticketed, ma'am." Evelyn's smile didn't fade. It sharpened. "Ticketed," she repeated slowly. "Yes, I'm sure. But there are different kinds of tickets." Marcus heard the shift in her tone before he heard the words. Not louder, just heavier. Naomi straightened in her seat. Caleb stopped fidgeting. Evelyn continued, still calm. "I'm a Platinum Crown member. I fly this route often, and usually there's a certain standard. She looked directly at the attendant now. "I'd appreciate it if you could check whether these seats were meant for crew rest, upgrades, or special circumstances." Special circumstances. The attendant hesitated. "Ma'am, all passengers here are assigned properly." Evelyn tilted her head. Assigned properly doesn't always mean assigned correctly. Marcus finally looked up, not defensively, just attentive. Naomi placed her hand gently on Caleb's knee. Evelyn noticed the movement. She always noticed. Her gaze flicked to the child, then back to the attendant. "And children in premier cabin? That's unusual, isn't it?" The attendant's shoulders tightened. "Children are allowed, ma'am." "Of course they are," Evelyn said quickly. "I'm not questioning the policy. I'm just concerned about the environment." Environment. Like the cabin was a fragile ecosystem that needed protection. Marcus turned slightly toward her. "Is there something we're doing that's disturbing you?" His voice was calm, even, not confrontational. Evelyn looked at him as if she hadn't expected him to speak. "Oh," she said softly. "I wasn't addressing you. I was speaking to the staff." The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn continued. "You see, when you pay a premium, you expect a certain level of consistency." Marcus held her gaze. "So do we." That made her pause, just for a second. Then she recovered. "I'm sure you do," she said, "in your own way." The cabin grew quieter, not silent, aware. Naomi leaned forward slightly. "We purchased these seats months ago," she said. "If there's an issue, we'd like to understand it." Evelyn glanced at her, then smiled again. "That's very responsible of you." Not kind, patronizing. The attendant cleared her throat. "Ma'am, everyone here has valid boarding passes. There is no issue." Evelyn exhaled slowly. "I see. Then perhaps the issue isn't procedural. Perhaps it's practical." The attendant frowned. "I'm not sure what you mean." Evelyn gestured subtly around the cabin. "This area is designed for passengers who value discretion. It's not meant to feel crowded." Crowded. There were 8 seats. 6 were empty. Marcus folded his hands together. "This doesn't feel crowded to us." "That's good," Evelyn said. "Truly. Comfort is subjective." She turned back to the attendant. "But standards are not." Thomas shifted in his seat, eyes fixed on the window. The attendant checked her tablet again, as if hoping the screen would offer a solution. "Ma'am, there is no mistake. All passengers are seated correctly." Evelyn's smile faded for the first time. "Just a little." "So you're telling me," she said, "that I paid for a premium experience, and I'm expected to accept this?" She gestured toward the Reed family. "Not directly, but unmistakably." Naomi stiffened. Marcus stood, slowly, deliberately. Not towering, not threatening, just present. "If you have a concern," he said, "we're right here." Evelyn looked up at him. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "No," she replied. "My concern is that the airline has lowered its standards." The word standards echoed. The flight attendant looked between them. "Sir, ma'am, please, let's keep things calm." Marcus nodded. "We are calm." Naomi was quieter, but her jaw tightened. Caleb stared at his hands. Evelyn crossed her arms. "I'm not trying to be difficult," she said. "I just believe in getting what I paid for." Marcus tilted his head. "So do we." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "And may I ask," she said, "what exactly you paid for?" Silence followed. Not because Marcus didn't have an answer, because the question itself was the answer. Naomi spoke first. "We paid for seats. We paid for a flight. We paid to be treated with the same respect as anyone else." Evelyn let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's a lovely sentiment." Then she turned back to the attendant. "I would like to speak to someone in charge." The attendant nodded, already uneasy. "I'll call the purser." Evelyn leaned back, satisfied, not because she had won, but because the process had begun. Marcus sat down again, slowly, carefully. Naomi looked at him. He nodded once. Caleb whispered, "Dad, are we in trouble?" Marcus leaned closer. "No, buddy, but she's mad." "Yes," Marcus said, "she is." The call light above Evelyn's seat glowed. Across the cabin, conversations had stopped, not openly, but people were listening now. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a test of whose presence needed justification, and Evelyn Carter had decided it was not hers. The purser arrived with a tablet in her hand and a calm that came from years of diffusing problems before they became scenes. "Yes, ma'am," she asked. Evelyn straightened immediately, like someone who had been waiting for an audience. "I'm concerned about a potential security issue," she said. The word security changed the air. Not louder, not faster, heavier. Marcus noticed how the flight attendant's posture shifted. Naomi felt it in the way her own shoulders tensed. Caleb looked up. "A security issue?" the purser repeated. Evelyn nodded. "Yes. I feel unsafe." The cabin froze around that sentence. The purser glanced at Marcus, then back at Evelyn. "Can you explain what you mean, ma'am?" Evelyn lowered her voice, not out of kindness, out of control. "There is a man who has been behaving in a way that makes me uncomfortable. He keeps challenging staff. He's refusing to respect the boundaries of this cabin." Marcus hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't stood since sitting back down. He hadn't touched anyone. But uncomfortable didn't need proof. It only needed to be spoken. Naomi turned toward Evelyn. "With respect, we haven't challenged anyone. We answered your questions, that's all." Evelyn didn't look at her. "I'm not talking to you," she said calmly. "I'm reporting a concern." The purser hesitated. "Sir," she said to Marcus, "have you done anything that might have been misinterpreted?" Marcus shook his head. "No, ma'am." His voice was steady, too steady in some people's eyes. Evelyn crossed her arms. "That tone," she said. "That dismissive calm. It's unsettling." Caleb shifted in his seat. Naomi leaned forward. "Are you saying my husband is a threat because he's calm?" Evelyn didn't answer that directly. "I'm saying," she replied, "that I paid for a premium environment, and when something feels off, I have a responsibility to say something before it becomes a problem. Before it becomes a problem." The purser looked at her tablet again, then back at Marcus. "Sir, would you mind showing your boarding pass?" Marcus handed it over without hesitation. The purser scanned it. Everything matched. Still, she didn't step away. Not yet. Evelyn watched carefully. This was the moment. Not when she shouted, but when the system paused for her. Because once the system pauses, it has already chosen a side. Evelyn continued. "You have to understand, in this world, people exploit rules. They exploit kindness. I've seen it happen." Marcus finally spoke again. "What exactly do you think we're exploiting?" She looked at him directly now. "The assumption that everyone here belongs here." Silence followed, not because anyone didn't understand, but because everyone did. The purser cleared her throat. "Ma'am, there is no indication of a threat. Evelyn lifted her chin. Then perhaps you're not looking closely enough. The word threat didn't mean danger. It meant permission. Once it was said, procedures could be activated. Once it was said, questions could be justified. Once it was said, doubt became official. The purser glanced toward the cockpit. Not yet, but she considered it. And that was enough. Because now, this was no longer about seating. This was about safety. This was how rules changed from protection to pressure. In spaces like this, rules are meant to protect people. But they can also protect accusations. They give structure to fear. They give authority to discomfort. The louder the concern, the more real it feels. The calmer the response, the more suspicious it becomes. Evelyn wasn't using anger. She was using procedure. She wasn't accusing. She was raising concern. She wasn't attacking. She was protecting her rights. And the system was listening. Because systems are built to respond to disruption, not to fairness. Naomi noticed the shift, not in words, in body language. The purser stood more formally. The flight attendant stopped smiling. A man across the aisle lowered his phone. Evelyn leaned back slightly, satisfied. She had done what she came to do, not prove guilt, just create doubt. Marcus sat still, too still, the kind of stillness that gets misread. Sir, the purser said, we may need to ask you a few routine questions. Of course, Marcus replied. Routine. A word that sounds harmless until you're the one being examined. Evelyn watched him carefully, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to see if he would break. People always break. That's when the system becomes certain. Marcus didn't. He answered politely. He didn't over-explain. He didn't apologize for existing. And somehow, that made things worse. Because systems trust emotion more than truth. They trust agitation more than clarity. They trust noise more than silence. Evelyn spoke again. I just want to make sure everyone here feels safe, especially in today's climate. Today's climate. Another word that carried weight without saying anything specific. The purser nodded slowly. I understand, ma'am. Marcus looked at Naomi. She met his eyes. No panic, just readiness. Caleb squeezed his hands together. Dad, he whispered, are we in trouble? Marcus leaned slightly toward him. No. But she says we're dangerous. No, Marcus said gently. She says she's afraid. The difference mattered, but not to the system. The system only hears urgency. And Evelyn had mastered the art of sounding urgent without ever raising her voice. That was her power. Not money, not status. The ability to turn discomfort into authority. The ability to turn opinion into procedure. The ability to make the system move for her. This was how rules stopped being shields and started becoming tools. They were never written for harm, but they could be steered toward it. The purser finally spoke. For now, everything is in order, but we'll keep an eye on the situation. Evelyn nodded. That's all I ask. She didn't smile. She didn't need to, because the balance had already shifted. This wasn't about proving guilt. It was about deciding whose fear mattered. And in this cabin, fear spoken softly, from the right seat, with the right tone, was already more powerful than innocence sitting quietly. The first sound that cut through the cabin wasn't shouting. It was the soft click of Evelyn's purse opening. She didn't rush. She never rushed. She placed the bag on her lap and searched through it slowly, as if the moment belonged to her. Lipstick, phone, a folded silk scarf. Then she froze. Her hand stopped moving. She looked inside again, longer this time. The quiet shifted. Naomi noticed first, that kind of stillness that doesn't feel normal. Evelyn's brows pulled together, not in panic, in calculation. She turned to Thomas. "Did you take my watch?" Thomas blinked. "What?" "My platinum watch. It was right here." He shook his head immediately. "No, Evelyn, I haven't touched it." She closed the bag and opened it again, harder this time. The cabin waited. Marcus watched her hands. Caleb watched her face. "I had it before boarding," Evelyn said. "I checked the time right before we sat down." No one responded. She looked around, slowly, deliberately. Her eyes passed over Marcus first, then Naomi, then Caleb, and stopped on Caleb. The boy was leaning against his mother, flipping through a small book he had brought for the flight. He didn't look up. Not yet. Evelyn tilted her head. "Did you see anyone near my seat?" Marcus shook his head. "No, ma'am." Naomi spoke gently. "We've been here the entire time." Evelyn's eyes never left Caleb. She leaned forward slightly. "Not enough to be obvious, just enough to feel close." "You were standing earlier," she said softly. Caleb looked up. "Yes, ma'am," he answered quietly. "You came down the aisle." "Yes, ma'am." "And my bag was open." Naomi's body shifted instantly. "He didn't touch anything." Evelyn raised a hand. "I'm just asking questions." Marcus leaned forward. "Why are you asking him?" "Because children don't always understand boundaries," Evelyn replied calmly. Caleb's fingers tightened around his book. The cabin went still again. "I need my watch," Evelyn continued. "It's not just jewelry. It's an heirloom, very valuable." The word valuable changed things. Naomi swallowed. "Are you suggesting my son took it?" Evelyn didn't answer directly. "I'm saying," she replied, "that things go missing, and it's usually not an accident." Marcus stood halfway from his seat. Naomi placed a hand on his arm. "Please," she said quietly, "let's slow this down." Evelyn turned toward the purser, who had remained nearby since the earlier security concern. "I believe there has been a theft." The word theft landed differently than discomfort. Heavier, sharper. The purser straightened. "Are you certain, ma'am?" "I am missing a platinum watch, and the only person who had access to my bag was that child." Caleb looked between his parents. "I didn't take anything," he whispered. Naomi wrapped an arm around him. "He did not take anything." Evelyn crossed her arms. "Of course he'd say that." Marcus finally stood fully. "That is my son. You are not going to accuse him like this without proof." Evelyn met his eyes. "Then you won't mind if we check?" The purser hesitated. "Sir," she said carefully, "this is a serious claim." "So is falsely accusing a child," Marcus replied. Evelyn's tone stayed level. "Then let the truth clear it." The cabin was no longer just watching. It was holding its breath. "Do you consent to a search?" the purser asked. Naomi shook her head immediately. "No, absolutely not." Marcus placed himself slightly in front of Caleb. "We do not consent to our child being treated like a criminal." Evelyn sighed, that familiar sigh, the one that sounded tired of explaining obvious things to difficult people. "If you refuse," she said, "then you make this look worse." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Evelyn, maybe it's just misplaced." She didn't look at him. The purser glanced toward the cockpit, and this time she did make the call. A few minutes later, 2 uniformed officers boarded. The change was instant. What had been social tension became legal gravity. Caleb shrank back into his seat. Naomi's hand trembled slightly as she held his shoulder. Marcus straightened his posture. The lead officer spoke calmly. "We've received a report of missing property." Evelyn nodded. "My platinum watch. I believe that child took it." The officer looked down at Caleb. "How old are you?" 10, he answered. "Did you take anything from this passenger?" Caleb shook his head quickly. "No, sir." Naomi spoke. "He has never stolen anything in his life." Evelyn interjected. "Children lie when they're afraid." The officer paused. "Ma'am, let us handle the questioning." She leaned back slightly, satisfied. The second officer approached Marcus. "Sir, can we ask you a few questions?" Marcus nodded. "Yes." They asked calmly. Where had they been seated? Had anyone approached their row? Had Caleb moved? Marcus answered everything, clearly, directly. Still, the presence of law enforcement changed the way people looked at them. Caleb noticed. He pulled his backpack closer. "I didn't do anything," he whispered again. Naomi kissed his hair. "I know." The officer finally said, "We're going to need to check personal belongings." Naomi stiffened. "You have no warrant?" "This is a plane, ma'am," the officer replied gently. "It's different." Marcus exhaled slowly. He nodded. "Fine, we have nothing to hide." They checked Marcus's bag first. Nothing. Then Naomi's. Nothing. Then they turned to Caleb. The officer knelt slightly to his level. "May I see your backpack?" Caleb hesitated. Naomi looked at Marcus. He nodded. Slowly, Caleb handed it over. Every zipper sounded loud. Every movement felt public. Books, crayons, a small stuffed keychain. Nothing else. Evelyn's lips tightened. "Check his pockets," she said. The officer hesitated. "He's a minor. If he didn't take it, there's nothing to fear." Caleb froze. Naomi's voice broke slightly. "You are not touching my child." The officer looked to his partner. They exchanged a glance. Protocol demanded they continue. Caleb stood slowly. His hands shook as he emptied his pockets. Tissue, a folded boarding stub. Nothing else. The silence was unbearable. Evelyn watched, unmoved. "Then where is it?" she asked. The officer turned back toward her. "Ma'am, we've found nothing on the child." She frowned slightly. "That's impossible." The officer shifted his stance. Perhaps it was misplaced. Evelyn opened her purse again, for the third time. Harder, more aggressively. And then she stopped. Her fingers closed around something solid. Slowly, she pulled it out. A platinum watch. The cabin exhaled all at once. She stared at it. Too long. The officers stared too. Naomi's grip tightened on Caleb. Marcus didn't speak. He didn't need to. The watch hadn't just appeared. It had always been there. The accusation hung in the air, unanswered, unretracted, unforgivable. Because a child had been treated like a criminal. Because fear had been weaponized. Because innocence had been questioned publicly. And even though the truth had surfaced, something had already been taken. The watch had been found. The truth was sitting in Evelyn's hand. And yet, nothing felt resolved. The officers didn't relax. The purser didn't step away. The cabin didn't return to normal. Because something had already shifted. Caleb didn't look relieved. He looked smaller. Naomi kept one arm around him, not to protect him from danger, but from the memory of what had just happened. Marcus remained standing, his hands open at his sides. Not defensive, not aggressive, just present. Too present. One of the officers cleared his throat. "Well, it appears the item was misplaced." Misplaced. A word that softened everything. A word that erased the accusation without undoing the damage. Evelyn didn't apologize. She didn't rush to explain. She simply said, "Well, that's fortunate." Fortunate. Not for the child who had just been treated like a suspect. Not for the family who had been publicly examined. But for her. The officers began to step back. And that was when something became clear. The louder voice had already been heard. The quieter one had already been judged. Marcus hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't demanded. He hadn't protested loudly. And somehow that had made him more suspicious. Naomi hadn't cried. She hadn't begged. She hadn't collapsed into emotion. And somehow that had made her less believable. Caleb hadn't screamed. He hadn't panicked. He had stood there and done exactly what he was told. And somehow that had made people wonder. Because in a world like this, calm doesn't always read as innocence. Sometimes it reads as guilt. The purser spoke carefully. "Thank you for your cooperation." Marcus nodded. "You're welcome." No resentment, no bitterness, just quiet dignity. And that made people uncomfortable. Because when someone shouts, you can dismiss them as emotional. When someone cries, you can label them fragile. But when someone stays calm under pressure, you start to wonder what they're hiding. It's a strange thing. The human mind trusts noise more than truth. It trusts urgency more than clarity. It trusts reaction more than reality. Evelyn had raised her voice just enough. She had shown concern just enough. She had displayed fear just enough. And the system had responded. Marcus had done the opposite. He had been steady, controlled, respectful, and that had made him harder to read, harder to trust. People believe pain when it's loud. They believe fear when it's visible. They believe innocence when it comes wrapped in chaos. But when pain is quiet, it gets ignored. When fear is controlled, it gets doubted. When innocence is calm, it gets questioned. The second officer glanced at Caleb one more time. "Son," he said gently, "you did nothing wrong." Caleb nodded, but he didn't smile. Because words spoken after harm don't erase harm. They just try to soften it. Naomi whispered, "Are you okay?" Caleb hesitated, then nodded again. A practiced nod. The kind children learn when they don't want to cause trouble. Marcus watched that nod closely. That was the moment he felt it. Not anger, not revenge. Responsibility. Because the world had just taught his son something. Not about honesty, not about fairness, but about how quickly innocence can be doubted when it doesn't perform the right kind of emotion. Evelyn gathered her purse. She stood smoothly, adjusting her jacket. No shame, no regret. Just closure. As if a misunderstanding had been resolved. As if a child hadn't been placed in the center of a public accusation. As if silence hadn't been mistaken for guilt. And the cabin allowed it. No one spoke. No one challenged her. No one asked for an apology. Because the moment had passed, but its meaning had not. This is the part no one talks about. We say we want truth, but we respond faster to emotion. We say we value calm, but we trust chaos more. We say we believe in fairness, but we look for signs of guilt in people who refuse to panic. Marcus hadn't defended himself the way people expect. He didn't shout. He didn't protest loudly. He didn't make a scene. And so, for a moment, the system didn't know what to do with him. Because the system is trained to respond to disruption, not dignity, to volume, not restraint, to fear that announces itself, not fear that sits quietly in a child's chest. That's why silence gets misunderstood. It doesn't look like innocence. It looks like hesitation. It doesn't look like honesty. It looks like strategy. And when someone is calm in a crisis, people assume they're hiding something. Not that they're strong, not that they're protecting others, just that they're not reacting the way guilt is supposed to look. The officers finally stepped away. The purser thanked everyone again. The cabin resumed its rhythm. But for the Reed family, something had changed. Not visibly, not loudly, but deeply, because now they knew something most people never have to learn. That sometimes being calm doesn't protect you. It makes you a question mark. And sometimes being quiet doesn't mean you're safe. It means you're easier to misunderstand. Marcus sat back down slowly, not because everything was over, but because he knew this wasn't the moment to speak. The cabin had moved on. The officers were stepping away. Evelyn was adjusting her purse like nothing had happened. And yet, something heavier than words filled the space. Naomi kept her hand on Caleb's shoulder, not tightly, just enough to remind him he wasn't alone. Caleb stared at the seat in front of him. Not angry, not confused, just quiet. Too quiet for a 10-year-old who had just been accused of a crime. And that was the moment Marcus understood something most people never have to think about. Power doesn't always need to speak first. Sometimes it waits. Because real power doesn't rush to prove itself. It watches, it measures, it allows the truth to unfold before stepping in. Marcus had the ability to end this earlier. He could have raised his voice. He could have demanded respect. He could have said who he was. And everything would have stopped instantly. The officers would have shifted their tone. The purser would have changed her posture. Evelyn would have gone silent. But he didn't. Not because he was weak, not because he was afraid, because he understood something deeper. If power is used to win an argument, then it stops being justice. It becomes domination. If authority is used to silence someone, then it doesn't protect truth. It replaces it. Marcus had let the system show its shape. He let the rules work the way they always do. He let fear choose its target. He let procedure reveal its bias. Only then does power mean something. Only when the truth is clear without it. Evelyn had spoken early. She had spoken often. She had used status, tone, and procedure to control the situation. That was loud power. Marcus used none of that. That was quiet power. And quiet power always looks like weakness to people who don't understand it. The purser returned to her station. The officers moved toward the door. The cabin exhaled. And in that silence, the difference became obvious. There are people who need to announce their importance, and there are people who don't. There are people who rely on titles, and people who rely on timing. There are people who use power to stop conversations, and people who use power to end injustice. Marcus watched Evelyn gather her things. She moved like someone who had survived a minor inconvenience, not like someone who had nearly destroyed a child's sense of safety. That was another truth. Power doesn't always feel heavy to the one who uses it. Sometimes it feels ordinary. That's why it's dangerous. Marcus looked down at Caleb. His son wasn't asking questions. He wasn't demanding explanations. He was learning. learning that the world doesn't always protect innocence, learning that calm doesn't always look safe, learning that sometimes silence is misread. And Marcus felt the weight of that lesson settle into his chest. Real power doesn't rush to win. It waits to protect. It waits until harm becomes visible, until innocence is threatened, until dignity is crossed. Only then does it speak, because power that speaks too early silences truth. Power that waits allows truth to stand on its own. Marcus had waited, not for revenge, not for control, but for clarity. And clarity had arrived. Evelyn had shown who she was. The system had shown how it worked. The officers had shown how procedure bends. Now, and only now, did power have meaning. Not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. Marcus reached for Naomi's hand. She met his eyes. No words passed between them. They didn't need to. They both knew what was coming. Not an argument, not a scene, but a moment when the truth would finally be undeniable. Power wasn't about who could speak first. It was about who could speak last and say something that mattered. The cabin thought the moment had passed. The officers were already turning away. The purser was adjusting her tablet, preparing to move on. That was when Marcus finally stood. Not fast, not dramatic, just enough to be noticed. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out his phone. Not to record, not to threaten, just to show something. The purser hesitated, then stepped closer. Evelyn rolled her eyes, like this was another attempt to waste her time. Marcus turned the screen toward the purser. Her posture changed, not slowly, instantly. Her shoulders stiffened, her breath caught. Her eyes scanned the name twice, then a third time. She didn't speak. She tapped the screen lightly, as if touching it would confirm it was real. Then she looked up at Marcus, and for the first time since boarding, she didn't look down on him. She looked at him. "Sir, may I see that again?" Marcus handed her the phone. She stepped back, not away from him, toward her station. Her fingers moved faster now, typing, scrolling, cross-checking. The intercom light blinked. Evelyn noticed. She straightened in her seat. The purser picked up the cabin phone. Her voice was calm, but lower than before. "Yes, this is cabin lead. I need confirmation on a shareholder profile." "Yes, Reed. Marcus Reed." A pause, longer than the others. "Yes, I understand." Another pause. "Yes, I'll handle it." She hung up. The cabin had gone silent again. But this time it was different. This silence wasn't fear. It was realization. The purser walked back toward Marcus. Her steps were measured. Her tone had changed. "Mr. Reed, thank you for your patience." Evelyn turned. Her smile froze halfway. The purser continued. "I wasn't aware of your presence on this flight. That was our oversight." Marcus nodded. "That happens," he said quietly. Evelyn leaned forward. "Excuse me, what is this about?" The purser turned slightly, enough to acknowledge her. "Mr. Reed is a major shareholder in Sky Atlantic." The words landed without sound, like pressure. Evelyn blinked. Once, twice. "That's not possible." Marcus remained still. The purser continued. "He's also one of the principal sponsors of our internal anti-bias training program." Naomi tightened her grip on Caleb's hand. The cabin shifted. Passengers leaned subtly forward, not openly, but enough. Evelyn's face drained of color. That must be a mistake." The purser didn't argue. She simply repeated it. It's not. Evelyn looked around, as if someone else would confirm reality for her. No one did. Her voice softened, just slightly. So you're saying he works with the airline? The purser corrected her. No, he helps shape it. Marcus spoke again, still calm. Tonight wasn't about who I am, he said. It was about how you treated my son. Evelyn swallowed. Her hand moved to her necklace, then dropped. The power in the cabin shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just completely. The purser turned to Marcus. We take incidents like this very seriously. Marcus nodded. I hope so. She turned to the officers who hadn't yet left the doorway. Please stay for a moment. Evelyn's breathing changed, shorter, shallower. The officers stopped. The purser looked at Evelyn. Ms. Carter, your accusation escalated a routine situation into a criminal one involving a minor. Evelyn raised her chin. I was protecting my property. Marcus looked at her. You were protecting your assumptions. The purser continued. We'll need to document this incident fully. Evelyn's voice wavered. You're treating me like I did something wrong. The purser didn't soften. Because you did. Evelyn turned toward Thomas, who had remained silent the entire time. He didn't meet her eyes. That hurt more than anything else. The cabin wasn't watching her anymore. They were watching the system correct itself. And systems only correct themselves when power shows up. Marcus hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't demanded authority. He had simply revealed where it already existed. The purser addressed Marcus again. Mr. Reed, we deeply apologize for the distress caused to your family. Marcus looked at Caleb. His son still hadn't spoken. That was the part that mattered. I accept the apology, Marcus said, but he needs to hear it too. The purser knelt slightly, lowering herself to Caleb's level. I'm sorry, she said. You did nothing wrong. Caleb nodded, once, small, but real. Evelyn watched the exchange, and for the first time, she wasn't in control of the narrative. The purser straightened. Miss Carter, due to the seriousness of your accusation and the involvement of law enforcement, we will need to follow protocol. Evelyn's eyes widened. You can't be serious. We are. The officers stepped forward, not aggressively, just officially. Thomas finally spoke. Evelyn, maybe we should cooperate. She stared at him, as if betrayal had just become physical. The power she had been holding on to all night was gone, not taken, exposed. The purser looked back to Marcus. We'll also be initiating a review of our response process. Marcus nodded. That's all I asked for. The cabin exhaled, not in relief, in clarity. This wasn't a victory. It was a correction. Evelyn had thought power was about money, about status, about speaking first. She had been wrong. Power was about responsibility, and responsibility had finally arrived. The cabin didn't erupt. There was no applause, no cheers, just a slow, uneasy stillness, because everyone could feel it. This wasn't only about Evelyn anymore. It never really was. The purser stood near the aisle, tablet pressed against her chest, not as a shield, more like a reminder. Around her, the crew shifted. Small movements, straightened backs, quieter voices. They were recalibrating, not because they wanted to, because they had to. The system had been exposed, and systems don't like mirrors. The officers exchanged a look. One of them nodded slightly, not in approval, in acknowledgement. They weren't here just for Evelyn. They were here because something had gone wrong earlier, and no one had stopped it. A flight attendant near the galley wiped her palms on her uniform. She hadn't said a word the entire time, but she had seen everything. The way the accusation started casually, the way it escalated, the way no one interrupted until it reached the edge of disaster. Marcus watched all of it quietly, not with satisfaction, not with anger, with clarity. Because punishment was easy, correction was harder. The purser cleared her throat. "We're documenting the full sequence of events," she said, "from the initial complaint to the involvement of law enforcement." She didn't look at Evelyn when she said it. She looked at her crew, one by one. "You will each submit a statement." The words carried weight, not blame, responsibility. Evelyn sat frozen. Her power had vanished so completely that even protest felt unsafe. Thomas remained beside her, still silent, not protecting, not defending, just witnessing. That was new. The purser turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Reed, your family will be compensated for the distress caused." Marcus shook his head slightly. "This isn't about compensation." She waited. "This is about what happens next time," he said, "to a family who doesn't have my name." The cabin absorbed that, because everyone understood it. This moment only unfolded the way it did because Marcus had standing, because he had influence, because he had access to power. Without that, the outcome would have been very different. A different family, a different ending. Naomi held Caleb close, not tightly, just enough. Caleb stared at the floor, not scared anymore, but changed. The purser followed Marcus's gaze. "We failed to protect him," she said. Marcus nodded. "Yes." There was no accusation in it, just truth. The purser exhaled slowly. "This will be reviewed at the highest level." Marcus didn't react. Promises were easy. Systems were slow. The cabin lights hummed softly. The aircraft felt smaller now, like the walls had moved closer, because everyone inside understood something uncomfortable. Evelyn was not the beginning of this story. She was the symptom. The failure had happened earlier, when her tone was ignored, when her language was softened, when her assumptions were tolerated. The failure was collective. A flight attendant stepped forward hesitantly. She spoke to the purser. "I should have said something sooner." No one responded immediately. Then another voice followed. "So should I." Then another. Small admissions, not dramatic, but real. The kind that systems depend on. Evelyn stared ahead. She wasn't being attacked. She was being outgrown. The narrative had moved past her. This wasn't about her downfall anymore. It was about accountability. Marcus addressed the purser again. "When power only corrects itself after it recognizes someone important, it isn't justice." She nodded. "It's privilege." He nodded back. "And privilege isn't protection. It's a warning sign." The cabin stayed silent, not because they didn't understand, because they did. Evelyn finally spoke. Her voice was thinner than before. "So I'm just the villain in this?" No one answered her, not because she wasn't, but because the story was bigger than her. The purser said it gently. "You were part of it." Evelyn swallowed. "Not the center. Not the end. Just part." That hurt more. The officers prepared to escort her, not forcefully, not hurriedly, formally. Thomas looked at Marcus, then at Naomi, then at Caleb. And for the first time, his eyes showed something unfamiliar. Shame. Not loud, not theatrical, just heavy. The cabin didn't feel victorious. It felt sober. Because justice wasn't a win. It was a responsibility. And responsibility meant admitting that this could happen again, unless something changed. The purser turned to her crew. "This incident will be used in training." She paused, not as a warning, as a lesson. Marcus finally allowed himself to sit back, not relieved, resolved. Because what mattered wasn't that Evelyn had been stopped. It was that the system had been forced to see itself, forced to admit. It hesitated. It assumed. It deferred to status. And in doing so, it endangered a child. Caleb looked up. "Can we go now?" Naomi smiled gently. "Soon." The purser addressed him. "We're sorry it took so long." Caleb nodded. He didn't say anything, but his silence was different now. It wasn't fear. It was processing. And that was the cost no report would capture. The cabin slowly returned to movement. Belts clicked, trays shifted, breathing resumed. But nothing felt the same, because everyone knew. Justice hadn't arrived because the system worked. It arrived because the right person forced it to. And that was the real problem. Not Evelyn, not one woman, but a structure that only responds when power speaks, and a society that waits too long before listening. The attention faded slowly, not all at once, not dramatically, just the way light does when the stage is empty. The officers escorted Evelyn down the aisle. No shouting, no resistance. Only the soft click of handcuffs and the sound of footsteps moving away. Some passengers watched, some looked down, some pretended to be busy with their phones. Justice had a sound, and it wasn't loud. Thomas stayed behind. He didn't follow her, didn't rush, didn't reach out. He remained seated, hands resting on his knees, staring forward like the cabin had turned into a courtroom, and he was still deciding what side he belonged to. A flight attendant paused beside him. "Sir, are you continuing on this flight?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes." That was all he said. Not my wife, not we, just yes. Evelyn was gone, but the consequences were just beginning. Back in their seats, Naomi wrapped a blanket around Caleb's shoulders even though the cabin wasn't cold. It was a habit, protection when words didn't work. Caleb didn't pull away, he didn't lean in. He just held the edge of the blanket between his fingers and stared at nothing. Not the window, not the aisle, nothing. Marcus watched him carefully. He knew that look. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger. It was confusion that had nowhere to go. The kind that settles deep and grows quiet. The purser returned to the cockpit. The crew resumed their duties. Drinks were served, trays were collected. Normalcy attempted a comeback, but it moved slower now, more cautiously, like everyone was afraid of doing the wrong thing again. Thomas finally stood. He looked smaller without Evelyn beside him, not physically, emotionally. He walked to the restroom and stayed there longer than necessary. When he returned, his eyes were red. Not from tears, from holding them back. He glanced once toward Marcus, toward Naomi, toward Caleb. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Some apologies are too heavy to speak. The flight continued. Miles passed, clouds shifted. But something inside the cabin stayed suspended. Marcus leaned closer to Caleb. "You did nothing wrong," he said softly. Caleb nodded, but he didn't respond. Because this wasn't about logic. It was about safety. And safety had been broken. Amy brushed a thumb along Caleb's hand. A small motion. A grounding one. The kind that says, "You're here. You're real. You're protected." But protection feels different after it fails once. Across the aisle, a woman whispered to her partner. "I can't believe that happened," he replied. "At least it worked out." "Worked out? For who?" Marcus heard it, and he understood. From the outside, this looked like balance restored, like justice delivered. But from the inside, it felt unfinished. Evelyn would face consequences, legal ones, social ones. But Caleb would carry this in ways no report could record. He would remember the sound of authority turning against him, the moment adults questioned his innocence, the instant his childhood felt conditional. That wasn't something an apology could erase. Thomas sat quietly for the rest of the flight. He didn't check his phone, didn't call anyone. He just stared forward. For the first time, he was alone with what he had tolerated. Not just today, but before. The comments, the looks, the assumptions, the silence he had mistaken for peace. When the cabin lights dimmed, Caleb finally leaned into Naomi's side, just slightly. She wrapped her arm around him. Marcus watched their reflection in the window. 3 silhouettes, still together, still steady, but altered. Justice had corrected a situation. It hadn't healed it. The plane landed. Passengers gathered their belongings, stood, waited. Normal movement returned, but the energy was different, quieter, heavier. Thomas remained seated until the aisle cleared. When he finally stood, he paused beside Marcus's row. He hesitated, then spoke. "I didn't stop her," he said. No explanation, no defense, just a fact. Marcus looked at him. "I know." Thomas nodded. That was all. He walked away. No closure, no redemption, just truth. Caleb watched him go, then looked up at Marcus.
"Are we in trouble?"
Marcus shook his head. "No." Caleb thought for a moment. Why did it feel like we were? Marcus didn't answer right away. Because sometimes the truth is too big for a child, and too painful for an adult. Because some people confuse power with being right, he said finally. Caleb nodded slowly. That was enough for now. As they exited the plane, the crew stood straighter, smiled differently, spoke more carefully. Awareness had been installed. But awareness isn't the same as change. Outside, the terminal buzzed with motion. Life resumed. Evelyn would become a headline, a story, a cautionary tale. Thomas would go home to a quieter house. Caleb would go home with a memory. And Marcus understood something most people don't. Justice doesn't end when the wrong is corrected. It ends when the harm stops echoing. And some echoes take years to fade. This wasn't a victory. It was a responsibility. Because after the spotlight moves on, after the outrage fades, after the story becomes old, someone still carries what happened. And it's usually the one who never asked to be part of it. Justice didn't arrive because someone powerful was exposed. It arrived because something wrong could no longer hide. That difference matters. Because if justice only shows up when the victim is strong, then justice isn't a principle, it's a privilege. And privileges can be taken away. Marcus never raised his voice, never used his name, never reached for authority until the system had already failed. That wasn't weakness. That was restraint. He didn't ask for special treatment. He asked for fairness. And those two are not the same. Fairness means the rules protect everyone, not just the people who know how to use them. Evelyn believed her status gave her control, that her membership card was a shield, that confidence could replace truth. She wasn't unique, she was just familiar. Because every system has people who learn how to bend it, who learn which words unlock power, who know when to speak louder and when to let silence work for them. And every system has people who assume someone else will step in. The flight attendant who hesitated, the passenger who looked away, the husband who stayed quiet. None of them caused the harm, but none of them stopped it either. That's how injustice survives, not through villains alone, but through permission. Caleb didn't need a powerful father to deserve protection. He deserved it because he was a child, because he was human, because he was innocent. Anything less is failure dressed up as order. Justice is not a reward for those who can afford it. It is an obligation owed to those who cannot. And that obligation doesn't start in courtrooms. It starts in moments, in how quickly we question, in who we believe first. In whether we pause before agreeing with the loudest voice in the room. Because systems don't collapse in one dramatic moment, they erode quietly, through habits, through convenience, through comfort, through silence. Marcus didn't expose power, he exposed weakness. A system that needed status to recognize humanity. A process that mistook confidence for truth. A structure that required a billionaire to remind it how to behave. That should make us uncomfortable, because justice should never depend on who's watching. It should be automatic, consistent, boring even, the kind that doesn't need a twist to function. Evelyn's story will be remembered as scandal, as spectacle, as karma. But Caleb's story is quieter. It's the story of a child who learned too early that trust can be fragile, that authority can be wrong, that safety can disappear without warning. And that lesson didn't require wealth, or power, or headlines. It only required one accusation. So the question isn't whether the ending felt satisfying, it's whether the beginning felt familiar. Because if it did, then this story isn't rare, it's routine. Justice isn't something that arrives when things go too far. It's something that should prevent things from going there at all. And that responsibility doesn't belong to Marcus. It belongs to us. To how we listen. To how we intervene. To how we decide who deserves doubt and who deserves belief. Because the real test of justice is not how it treats the powerful when they fall. It's how it treats the powerless before they're harmed. So next time you witness discomfort, next time you hear an accusation that feels too easy, next time you notice someone being isolated, questioned, or dismissed, don't wait for authority to act. Be the moment that shifts the balance. Because justice is not a prize you win, it's a duty you carry. And society only keeps it alive when ordinary people choose not to look away.